Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm Jennifer Chase, the Executive Director of Education Action Forum of Maine, also known as the Ed Forum. Our program tonight features Ted Dintersmith in conversation with Glenn Cummings and a panel of Maine educators. It's a part of the Education Innovators Series, co-sponsored by Ed Forum, Educate Maine, the Center for Innovation in Education at Thomas College, and the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. And you can hold the date now for our next event in the series, which will be on May 16th, when we will host Rob Hubin of the Agora School in the Netherlands in conversation with Maine educators and entrepreneurs. So tonight's event is also a part of Maine Education 2050, which is a special collaboration between Ed Forum and Educate Maine, along with the Maine Resilience Building Network. And I want to share the project with you just briefly, because we hope that you'll be inspired to participate. So there are three major phases of this project. First, Maine Education 2050 seeks to learn what youth will need from their education to thrive personally, civically, and economically in Maine at 2050. And we're doing this through over 150 focus group conversations all around the state and every county with youth, educators, community members, and industry leaders. Second, we'll investigate how what we learn can best be understood and utilized by those in our education ecosystem. So we'll make the learnings public through a web-based dashboard developed in collaboration between MIT and the Rue Institute. And this is going to be accessible to everybody. We'll have reports and white papers to share with legislators, Department of Education, the Maine State Board of Education, and others. And third, we will use those learnings to orient us at a multi-day, in-person, fall 2022 Education Innovation Summit, where we will begin to build a network of major education stakeholder organizations here in Maine for intentional, future-focused, coordinated action. We will put our paddles in the water together to turn the boat downstream, as Ted likes to say, toward thriving for all. So please follow the links that you will get in follow-up emails to sign up more, find out more, sign up and find out more, and be in touch if you would like to be a collaborating organization. So you may have noticed that I've used the word collaborate more than a few times, and that is intentional. It's because the future of education is in collaboration between students, between teachers, between school and family and community, between nonprofits and philanthropy and industry, at every level of the system. And we can't wait for things, right, to settle down and return to normal. We need to be taking action now, like many of you are here in the room tonight. As Commissioner MAKIN said just over 2 years ago in March of 2020, the system needs to be restructured. But how? What should it look like? How will it function in Cutler and Kittery, in Fort Kent and Lincoln, and every place in between? How does the system evolve over time in ways that acknowledge both our historical successes and our emerging needs, our common values and our unique local cultures, real industry workforce needs, and each student's hopes and dreams? These are really big questions that need to be addressed, and we won't be able to do it any other way than together. So we'll take advantage of the powerful learning that's happened in classrooms all over Maine the past 2 years, and we'll host international and national thought leaders here in conversation with Maine educators to stoke the fires of our imagination and to get down to the practicalities of realizing our dreams. There's a lot to be proud of already here in Maine, right? Everyone in this room here tonight knows that. And we'll use that to fuel our work to ensure that everyone thrives, youth, educators, communities, and industries. So now let's get to the fun part. Why you're here tonight. Ted Dintersmith has dedicated this phase of his life to enabling the restructuring Commissioner MAKIN spoke of. His organization and his book, What School Could Be, inspires and supports educators to create learning environments that allow themselves and their students to thrive. And it challenges communities to rise to the task of collaborating with our schools and educators to help them succeed. Ted is a former venture capitalist who has retired to a very full life of writing, producing, and traveling all across the country. He tirelessly shares the idea that our American school system, through our educators in our local communities, can evolve, can meet the needs of our present and our future in ways that make educating and learning an enjoyable, sustainable, productive endeavor for all. And tonight you'll hear a special challenge that he has for Maine educators. So we're also very lucky to have Dr. Glenn Cummings, the president of University of Southern Maine, a former legislator and high school teacher, here in conversation with Ted and our esteemed panelists, Commissioner MAKIN, Jeremy Jones, Boyd Marley, and Alana Markson. So welcome, Ted and Glenn.
Fabulous to be here.
Thank you.
Well, we'll get started on our side. I wanted to just welcome everybody. And Jennifer, thank you so much for your introduction. And I'm really honored to be able to have this conversation with Ted. I've been an admirer, and this is an excellent opportunity for us to get Ted to talk a little bit in more depth about his thinking, which is different from most of us as we entered the profession. In fact, I think that may be my first question to Ted. So a lot of us, started teaching when we were probably too young and, stumbled through it and tried to hang on. That's my story anyway. And at the same time, you come from a very different perspective. You are a venture capitalist. Tell us the strange, perhaps, or maybe interesting at least, path by which a venture capitalist became one of America's leading educational theorists.
Well, I always hesitate, and I feel a degree of reservation about being introduced as anything around education expertise. I can talk about that in a second. I would like to start just by thanking Jennifer and everybody involved for this great event. I mean, even on Zoom, I can feel the energy in this gathering. And Glenn, thanks for taking time. I'm a huge fan of all the work you've been doing. I really got started on this, with no real context in education, but as my kids were going through school, at a certain point, it's a funny story. I'll just be brief about it. But when they were in middle school, the school sent a note to parents saying, we've got this brand new initiative that we're releasing next month, and we're going to be helping your kids learn important life skills. And my first reaction was, great, that's fantastic. The school's going to teach my kids life skills. And so I started to think, I said, well, wait a minute, why is this a new initiative? That doesn't make that much, isn't that what schools should be all about, preparing kids for life? And I just started to look at what they were being asked to do in a bit of a different light, and came at it from the vantage point, if I have any differential advantage in the work I do, it's having spent 40 years at the forefront of innovation. And I was with one of the top venture firms in the country, been involved with all sorts of investments in sectors changing every aspect of society. Don't blame me, but we were first round investors in Twitter. So we worked with the A-tier entrepreneurs and saw these things. And I have a really informed perspective on how things are changing for our kids going forward. One of the things I say is, if it's routine, it will be done by machine, just flat out. And people underestimate, I think, at the peril of kids and society, how fast machine intelligence is advancing. It's not tapering off. It's not steady as she goes. It's exponential. My friends in the tech world say that over the last 2 years of COVID, there's been 10 years of digitization of the economy in 2 years. So if it's routine, it's done by machine. But it's not necessarily bad news. It's just consequential news in that the values, the character traits, the things you really need in this world where the routine stuff could be outsourced to automated solutions are creativity, curiosity, audacity. And I started looking at what was going on, first with a school, and then a few schools, and then lots of schools. I said, wait a minute, these kids are actually being discouraged from doing out of the box things. They're being told, you've got to buckle down. You've got to do things that honestly, this with Siri does perfectly. And I just said, no, I don't want that to happen to kids. I don't want kids to be penalized for thinking of something that most people think doesn't make sense, but actually has some profoundness to it. And so as I started visiting more schools, I said, this is not a minor thing. This disconnect between schools and accountability measures. And this is what I think what I've learned along the way is it's really an obsolete model and misguided accountability metrics that are driving certain priorities in schools that I don't think teachers actually embrace or want. I don't think are good for the futures of our kids. And I think, collectively, we need to step back and say, wait a minute, is this process advancing their futures or not? And so that got me, that seemed like a big, important challenge. And I'll add just one note, and then we can get to other things, is that when I started connecting these dots, I said to my wife, this goes back over 10 years ago, I said, if we don't start getting this right, I'm not sure our democracy will survive. And she said, don't tell anybody else you think that. I mean, that's gonna frighten people. I said, no, I'm gonna tell some other people. And I think the word was, oh my gosh, retirement's not agreeing with Ted. He's kind of lost it. What's this stuff about democracy may not survive? A lot of those people have circled back to me lately and said, now tell me again why you think education priorities and the health of our democracy are so closely coupled. And they are, we know that.
So Ted, I just want to jump back. By the way, that's very pretentious of you to have anticipated, I think, what has been happening in the last 5 years, 10 years ago. I mean, many of us sort of talked about that sort of in abstract terms when we started teaching. I was a social studies teacher, and this issue of understanding citizenry, understanding our roles, understanding the commitments to small d democracy, understanding what was at stake and how we had sacrificed to get where we are. And to see it start to crumble is a little scary. But I want to actually go back to, I have a theory that you validated in our discussion the other day, that if you had been a CEO of a major company, you would have thought differently. But you actually are, for those who are not familiar with venture capitalists, they look at potential and they find ways to seed that potential and sometimes counsel that potential to be their very best and most profitable. I think that framework is the framework that you're talking about in things like most likely to succeed in other places. Talk to us about how a venture capitalist thinks differently than us CEO types, which are often in a box. How do you think about education in the way that you perhaps thought about capital and how to nurture capital?
Well, life is a venture capitalist. So we work with, find, support entrepreneurs who have their dream. We are not in the business of telling anybody what their dream should be. Our goal and mission in life is to support people in achieving their dreams. And that is a really different perspective you bring. And I get asked, you look at the Gates Foundation, right? You look at.
Would somebody just write that in the chat somewhere so we can have that, Jennifer? Will you write that in the chat? I am in the business of helping people achieve their dreams. What a great idea. I mean, on a good day, maybe I thought that in education, but Ted, thank you for pointing that out.
Well, it's night and day difference. So a contrast, people ask me this a lot, like the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates. Well, Bill Gates was a CEO. CEOs generally think they know what we should do, and their role is to give people their marching orders. And I think that's the way most organization leaders tend to think about things. Not all, but most. And so you look at something like Common Core, a perfect example. Were there some good ideas behind Common Core? I think there clearly were. But this was, again, a small body of people deciding what everybody across the country needed to do, and boom, plopping it on their desk and saying, you've got to do it. And the point I make is that even Bill Gates, with all the money he has, or the US Department of Education or a State Department, if you want to make people do something they have no voice in, nor believe that is really in their best interest, there's no amount of money that can make that happen. I think that largely explains, decades of education policy in the United States. If you turn it around and say, what is it you want to accomplish? And how can I help you? It's not a money issue, it's a mindset issue. And everything that we do, the film shows that, and it's really not just students, it's the educators working, it's everybody, right? It's like, how can I help you accomplish what you think is important? And you just have to have a degree of trust here. And I do, I maybe sometimes too much, but you have to trust that if you invite a student to think about what they'd like to accomplish, they're not going to say, oh, I'd like to just sit in a corner and play video games all day long. And guess what? When you actually have that discussion, they don't sit in a corner and play video games all day long. They have dreams. They have things they want to do. And with same thing, educators, the film does a great job of showing the potential of educators when they're trusted to teach to their expertise and passions. We show it. If you haven't seen, I'll toss it in the chat when I get a chance, but or Jennifer can get it to you, the film Most Likely to Succeed. We show two side-by-side classes, 9th grade, same school. They're doing nothing similar, and there's no overlap whatsoever. This was not somebody at the state of California or somebody in their district or somebody at the head of the school saying, you are going to do this on October 17th, period. They just could do what they wanted to do. And over and over, that's what I found as I traveled, is when you find people doing amazing work, it's not something someone told them they had to do. It's what they wanted to do. And I think a key message for educators in the field, particularly if you're in administration, is every single classroom teacher I write about, that we film, that we get excited about, I'll ask them, where did this really interesting thing you're doing come from? It was their idea. They may have been inspired by something else, but it wasn't, oh, I got an email saying I had to do it. It's their idea. And then I'd say, what was the key to making this happen? And they would say, so-and-so, generally a principal, but somebody, they had my back. They said, if somebody takes issue because it's not the normal thing, you've got kids understanding science by doing a bold project on water quality in their area, or who knows what, somebody had my back. And I think it's really a core insight about human nature. I mean, when do people do their most amazing work? They do it when they believe in it. And
let's link that to the larger. So we have a teacher shortage across the country. It's getting worse and getting more intense. What you're talking about is the professionalization of the teaching profession, not the diminishing and or of the core of the profession, which is sometimes restricted to follow these, as you say, these sort of rote expectations. So talk to us a little bit about what you think the implications are for the teaching profession when you talk that way. So what are the things that could reignite that kind of desire to be a teacher? And we're seeing these mass resignations and retirements across the country and here in Maine. I think I noticed one small gray hair on PENDER MAKIN's head, that one among her many challenges is that she is losing teachers really rapidly. I mean, is this what recommendations might you give us here in Maine that would help us, I think, accelerate the professionalization of teaching and make it more rewarding?
Yeah. Complicated question, an important question. And first, I would say to everybody on this call, I am fully aware in my conversations with people how challenging the last 2 years have been, and how everybody has really been under all sorts of strain and stress and challenge. And for those who feel frustrated or tired or whatever, I will say this: I hung around for years with marathon runners, and so I liken today to being at mile 23 of a marathon no one signed up to run. And I think it's very tempting, and marathon runners would say the same thing. At mile 23, I just said, I'm just going to get done, and I may never put running shoes on again. But when you go back to those marathon runners 5 years or 10 years later, they look at that race and say, I am so proud of having run that race. It was a life highlight. And I think every single person on this call will look back on this very challenging period and feel immensely proud of staying with it and supporting their kids. And there is an unprecedented degree of fatigue and grumpiness and a bunch of other things. If I could, snap my fingers and make changes, which I have to get used to being in a life where if I snap my fingers, not even my dog pays attention. So, but I think there are important lessons to draw from Finland, right? I mean, Finland, pays their teachers, not massive salaries, but they pay them commensurate with their essential role in society. And I think our states need to start looking at it that way. They also really upgraded the School of Education offerings. It's very difficult to conduct a student-driven agile classroom with real-world challenges and authentic assessments, all the things we believe in that we capture in the film Most Likely to Succeed in a lot of our video resources. If you were in a School of Education sitting at a desk taking notes, and so I think the schools of education need to up their games. But it's really interesting when you visit schools. I visited them in Finland. The teachers just feel, well, there's a great joke in Finland, which is a doctor, a lawyer, and a teacher walk into a bar, and the bartender asks them, so what do you do for life? And one says doctor, one says lawyer, one says teacher. And they say, how'd you end up doing this? And the doctor says, well, I wanted to be a teacher, but I couldn't get in, so I became a doctor. And the lawyer says, well, I wanted to be a teacher, but I couldn't get in, so I settled for being a lawyer. And it's really that degree of respect in their society, but also immense trust in the classroom. And I would say we trust the lives of our kids with teachers. One of my most moving experiences was in Emporia, Kansas, at the National Teachers Hall of Fame. And they have this knoll with all these memorials to teachers that lost their lives in schools protecting kids. I mean, you can't go without sobbing. And I say, how is it we trust teachers with the lives of our kids, but not with their lesson plans? And I think that's where we are so short-sighted, because done right, I think it's an immensely rewarding. I mean, that's what I hear over and over again. Given support, given trust, I feel so full of purpose in my life. But if we come along and say, oh, no, you've got to be on page, a perfect example, right, is this wave of, I'm doing a video now on trying to get to angry parents because I have some history there. But this lunatic call for transparency, parents' rights. We demand transparency. Tell us every single thing you're going to cover for the next 9 months or something. I mean, what are they thinking, right? I mean, you couldn't take a more direct path to ruining kids' chances to learn and driving our best teachers out of the profession. And so I feel like we need a bit of a wake-up call, because it is, what profession will have the most influence on the future of our nation? I would say, our faculty. And, man, we should be just honoring them, respecting them, thanking them for the last 2 years, and making sure they get, which is what we're really trying our best to do, is to offer in the field professional development resources that go well beyond and above what a common complaint I hear, which is what we get in the field we don't really think is particularly good. And so we have these great things. We're working with some schools of education, and I'm bragging a bit, but I really do think it's extraordinary, because we capture great practices in the field. We are not the CEO saying, oh, we had a few people that said this is what you have to do. We work like crazy to get out and understand what people are doing and say, what are you doing that's great? Would you mind if we film you? And bring it to life for other teachers, and not say, copy this, but say, here's what they were doing in Hopewell, Virginia. Here's what they were doing in Jamestown, North Dakota. Here's what they were doing in who knows where. We've got them from all over the country, all around the world, actually. But just to sort of get people thinking, oh yeah, well, we could do that, but we could do even better. I think that's where you start to get things bubbling up and happening, is when people feel somebody has their back if they do something innovative, when they have a sense of informed innovation, not just change for change's sakes, not just toss some useless math lesson on an iPad and call it innovation, but a way to challenge kids that help them develop competencies that matter. And then people start getting excited about it. And if you can build that enthusiasm and excitement for it, it's very contagious.
Ted, I've got to tell you that in the chat, there are already people who are saying 2050 is way too long. They want this tomorrow and deserve. Tell me though that a little bit of so somebody might say, well, yeah, that sounds good, but shouldn't you have some standards? I mean, shouldn't there be some agreed upon understandings? Do you want to make it totally freelance? I mean, is this going to help survive, help the democracy survive? And I tell us a bit. I don't think you're saying that, but just in case anybody's thinking that in the back of their head, like, that's a little too loosey-goosey for me. What would you say to them?
Yeah, do I think student work should be held to a high standard? Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. What high standard? I think that's a really key question. And so I'll go after one of the most important drivers of high school standards, and one I think I've got a bit of a high ground on, math standards. Because I'm not bragging, but I have a PhD in math modeling from Stanford, and I spent a career backing algorithm-based companies. So I'm not Mickey the dunce on this stuff. There almost none of the things taught in high school are used by adults. I mean, it's just stunning to me. I will hear these people that have no idea what they're talking about, that will go on and on about the importance for all kids to take calculus. Well, I've spent 7 dang years, 100,000 people, combined audiences, trying to find one adult who does a closed form integral by hand professionally. The answer is zero. So we've got these people who don't know what they're talking about, laying out what kids have to be good at. that turn into barbed wire fences for kids' futures instead of enabling and empowering standards, right? And so why would we, why would you say you've got to be able to do hyperbolic cosine transformations to get into a college or to major in engineering? It's like nobody's doing that. People at Boeing aren't doing it. 3D solid modeling company engineers aren't. Nobody's doing it. And yet it just hangs around from a time period that I actually go back to, dating myself, when you did have to do it by hand. It used to be a useful standard, but it is totally obsolete in today's world where photo math, you just put your camera over the expression, it lays out the steps and gives you the answer. So what I advocate for, supposing we said high standard, that students through the process of K through 12 can demonstrate, they can create and carry out audacious initiatives that affect positive change in their world, completed to a high standard. And that we're going to look for a portfolio of those, and college admissions officers are going to look for a portfolio of those. We're going to want students through high school years to be able to demonstrate aspects of informed, responsible citizenship. I'll give you a standard I think that we should have in every state to graduate from high school: fact checking. Maybe it's the exception in some of your schools. I've done a pretty exhaustive search for high schools teaching fact checking. It is like you can't find, it's just not existing. Some friends I backed, a group that I back, did an evaluation. Can our absolute best college students, so juniors and seniors, most selective schools in the country, fact check? No. What does it take to make an academic superstar to convince them something's true? A professional looking website, a credible URL that ends in .org, and footnotes. Now, like, I'm a fan, like discriminating, fact from something wholly made up. Yeah, I think that's a standard that we should hold people to. But instead, it's like memorize the three branches of government. And the problem is 2/3 of adults can't name them, right? And so if the standard is fact-based, that's crammed for an exam and then gone in a matter of weeks or days, what have we accomplished with that standard? If the standard is something that made sense in 1950, but doesn't make sense in 2022, and certainly doesn't make sense in 2050, what have we accomplished? And the issue is, and I think this really gets to it, is if you feel the most important thing about standards is to be able to compare kids in different communities across Maine to each other, compare kids in a community in Maine to a kid in a school or teacher or kid in Alabama to whatever. If it's going to be done in bulk at scale, those are very difficult evaluations to do in any nuanced way. Nobody in their right mind would say, we're going to compare a kid in Bangor who has done a lot of great work to bring positive change to their community and just stare down failure and learn things on the fly and kind of invented around certain problems and came up with something great. Compare that kid to Tuscaloosa or Missoula or whatever. Good luck, you can't do that. But you can do these bubble tests, right? Which is where you get AP exam, where you get all this stuff, because then you've got these numbers that give you the ordinal rankings. But the issue, and I have pushed the College Board on this for a long time, they're not particularly interested. I'm skeptical it's retained. I've asked them, I said, please, you got $1.2 billion cash reserve amassed over years as a nonprofit, $1.2 billion sitting in your bank. Do a few voluntary audits of students who got a 5 on AP exams 3 months later and see if they retained it. And if you come back and say, man, they're retaining this all, I'd say, okay, there's some really good stuff going on here. But I think if they knew they were retaining it, they would do that evaluation, and they don't want to.
Ted, you do have a PhD from Stanford, but you have been criticized for your pronunciation of Bangor. We're going to work on that later after the.
I should stick with Portland. I could say that.
Ted, I want to go to the issue that you mentioned briefly. I know it's been much on many of our minds at the Southern Maine Partnership out of USM. We talk about it a lot, and I know Commissioner MAKIN has been very committed to trying to execute it as best we can. Is the quality of our assessments, I think you were just talking about that, right? So the quality of our assessments, can we make them real? Can we make them authentic? Can we make them meaningful? Can we make it something that students will remember, maybe even for the rest of their lives? Tell us a little bit about how you see the role of assessment. In other words, real life problems being able to be the center, really, of what we're trying to tackle in the classroom and beyond.
Yeah. Well, one state, I'm a big fan, and I write in my book about what Jenny Berry and Maggie Hassan did in New Hampshire, where the teachers were really unhappy with the accountability frameworks there. And so they said, okay, why don't you take the lead and tell us what you would like to be held accountable to? And the teachers did. I mean, it was really grassroots driven, and I sat in on some of these sessions where they would, pick a topic. So 8th grade language arts, they'd have portfolio of examples of student work that would be consistent with outstanding, proficient, satisfactory, whether they had their gradations. And they just show a few examples of clear writing, or, that was a good metric for them, or a good measure. And then they'd ask their class, the teachers in the field to evaluate students according to those kind of benchmarks. And then they'd have a summer audit process where they, if a school was saying everybody's outstanding, well, everybody's probably not outstanding, but they would audit some of those portfolios, and then everybody come together, but school board members and legislators and outside observers like me could sit in on it. And people would look, okay, you said this portfolio, we are looking at these 10 student portfolios from high school XYZ, and you said these were outstanding, proficient, satisfactory. Let's actually look at the work and make sure your evaluations make sense. So it was like out of hundreds that summer, I think they identified 3 or 4 that seemed like they were really off. And my point is, we don't have a problem evaluating the quality of complicated work. We have a real problem if we try to turn it into one number that then can be measured across a state or across a country. But I mean, I'm sure you've seen it. I mean, you've dealt with a lot of, when somebody turns in papers, that this is really a great paper. This is a pretty good paper. Same thing with when you're interviewing. When you interview somebody, I don't need to know what every other venture capital firm thought of this, prospective, associate or something. You just talk to them. I used to ask. This is why I'm such a believer in it, because in my career in venture, I quickly ran from academic superstars, where most people in venture loved academic superstars. Like somebody I used this exact flow one day at breakfast, and it was this person's exact flow, so I have to be careful. But I said, like the ones I really don't want to back are Exeter, Princeton, Harvard Business School, Baker Scholar. That's not going to be a world changer. And of course, that was that person. But I would look for unconventional backgrounds, but I would ask them this. I'd say, send me 3 writing samples that tell me what I should know about you. And, it's like, it was so, I would say this to the college admissions, events that I addressed admissions officers. I say, don't tell me you can't do it, because I did it for 25 years. And 5 of those 25 years, I was ranked as the best venture capitalist in the country. So it's not, it didn't take much time. It was actually really interesting. It was highly effective in figuring out who was going to be really outstanding. And why aren't we looking at that? And so that's, to me, is where you can, if you look,
and it seems like that is exactly where we are going. What we've started to see around applications coming in. And so our traditional is just, let's write a 3-page resume, and here's where I used to work, and here's where, et cetera, and here are my references, et cetera. But now we're seeing these electronic portfolios, which are fantastic, which I can then say, I'd like to click on Tori Cornfield's resume, and I can find out what 3 people who worked with her in the Maine legislature said about how difficult or how easy she was to work with or not, how original she was in her thinking, right? And she can't see this. I can just click on there and see this. I can see a video of her giving a speech on the floor of the Maine House. I can see her reading some poetry to her for her education committee, which she used to do. And by the way, I don't think anybody has ever done that in the history of the Maine legislature. I could see things in these new portfolios that I haven't seen before. it's capturing a full 360 of a human being, right? And it's capturing them for things that we normally would not look at. For example, when we're looking at somebody to trying to come into a graduate school, we look at their GRE scores, right? And instead, now we have the technology to actually see all 360 degrees of Tori Cornfield or one of our students. So the potential now is getting enormous, but we have, as somebody said in the chat, I want to kind of go back to it. I know we're getting towards the end here, Ted, but they specifically said that we're often, as teachers, compliance. We've chosen compliance over innovation, right? We've chosen compliance over acceleration of ideas and natural curiosity, right? And partly, I think, inferred that collective bargaining units also need to be brought in that process. How do we bring the profession into that place where we're not just compliant managers, but we are truly the accelerators of curiosity, really the shepherds of somebody's greatest potential? And what are some of the things that we do to make that happen?
Well, we've worked really hard to create, primarily great videos that sort of bring to life what's at stake here. And so we have it's a 3-minute piece on the future of work where we just lay out all the stuff that's going to get automated away. The point I make, and I feel like I have to make this, is that whether the kid is valedictorian or at the bottom of their class, if they leave school strictly good at memorizing material, replicating low-level procedures, and following instructions, which every school I visit, I say, if I have a student here who's like that, where will they end up? And they say they'll be on the honor roll. They will spend most of their life in a world of hurt. And the good news is, if you look at every 4 and 5-year-old, they are just brimming with creativity and curiosity and will try a million things and everything else. And so we don't have to put something in people that doesn't exist. We just have to stop crushing it out of them. And some of you may know, I teamed up with Sir Ken Robinson, and the world lost him, which was quite tragic collectively. But the same thing, do schools kill creativity? I think people just sort of said, absolutely they do. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that in 1950, it was probably a good thing to kill people's creativity if most of the people were going to pursue factory jobs. But in 2022 and certainly 2050, if you don't have those going for you, you're going to be in a world of hurt. I think the opportunity, and it's probably a good thing to emphasize here, is that when you have a state like Maine with really great people involved in key roles and a lot of ground support for doing something different, the opportunities aren't to just edge ahead of Massachusetts on test scores. It's like the upside here is fantastically off the charts. What these middle and high school kids can do in a world where they can learn anything they want, in a world where they are just incredible in what they can accomplish. If we just start leaning into that, it is, like unbounded. I mean, Ken and I called our thing boundless. So boundless potential. And so I sort of say back to people, if in fact you knew, if we didn't rethink the priorities in school, that most of our kids will be in and out of crappy jobs. Many will be incarcerated or homeless. But if we did rethink this, we are going to let these kids pursue amazing opportunities in a way that actually provides differential advantage to the kids that need the most support. And I think that's an important point to stress, because the rich kids get through this stuff because parents will say, get a good grade or do really well this semester, I'll get you a new iPhone, get a 1,500 on your SAT, I'll get you a BMW. I hang around some of those people. I know what they're capable of doing. So, kids in circumstances, I grew up in the circumstances of the kids I fight for, where your family has no money. You don't have somebody pushing you through stuff you don't care about. But what I find over and over again is you give those kids a chance to take on something they think is important, something they care about, something that will reward them for trying 3 things that fail and then get back on their feet and get the 4th one to work. It is just a very exciting future to visualize. And so I'm like all over, when Jennifer called and said she was putting this together, I said, not only would I do this, but I mean, I'll do anything I can to help, because I think we need those proof points nationally. We need agile states with vision and commitment to show the rest of the country and the rest of the world what can be done.
Ted, I'm going to stop you there. I think you have as already, just at least from the chat and the smiles, I think you've already excited us to go on to the next level. But before we move into that panel, tell us what you're doing. What's next for Ted Dintersmith in education? What are you working on now? What are you thinking about that we should just be aware of? And what next great book or YouTube clip should we be looking for?
Well, I'm working on several things, but one, and I think we'll follow up with this group, is I feel like I don't want to see a third school year start where we failed to take advantage of what we learned from the previous period. What did we learn during the whole disrupted time we've just been through? I think we learned to direct and manage their learning and draw on motivation because they think it's important, were the kids that kept learning. And the kids that just were sitting in person and then were sitting at home on Zoom, that's been just an even bit, what was a disaster in person is a massive disaster on Zoom. And so my shameless bag here is to get a few, sprouts starting to pop out of the ground in different places in Maine this spring. And I know it's a really crazy time. It's mile 23 of the marathon, but we're going to be begging groups to sort of hold up their hand with just a little tiny starter steps, something like a few hours this spring to gain some confidence that it can be done. And then I'll beg Jennifer to put together a summer summit where we say, look, we've got people across Maine starting to make progress here, get that flywheel turning. And one of the things I'm particularly excited about, and I'll just briefly outline it here, and then we could pursue it in a later session if that's, or event if that's interesting, is what I noticed when I went back and reread my book is that over and over again, I was writing about kids who were identifying things they wanted to get good at, largely learning it on their own, getting really good at it, refining, mastering it in the context of being great citizens in their school and community. And at the end of that process, had skills that would let them earn more than most college graduates. And oh, your cat is getting excited about this, I could tell. So the whole idea, you've got kids in, third, fourth, and fifth grade in West Virginia in a really poor area who become IT consultants. You've got kids in eighth grade in Fargo making documentaries and websites. You've got kids in Albuquerque, New Mexico doing social media campaigns. You've got this young woman in Vermont getting good at website design who's an artist, but suddenly does that. And so I've been sort of floating this in different areas saying, are you up for piloting this? And I'll make it very specific to just give you a sense of how amazing it could be. Is certainly every middle and high school school in Maine has sports teams, right? And almost every sports team has one or two kids who can't make the team, but they are managers. And they love the sport so much that they'll pick up towels in the locker room, they'll lug Gatorade things to the playing field, practice field, whatever, and good for them. But I'm saying, what if we had all of these teams had a digital media team that went with it? A website for the fans, a social media campaign to make the community aware of it, podcast episodes about the season, interviews with players and coaches, statistics to predict the score of an upcoming game, great logo, like a whole set of these things, which kids would just be like, I am so all over this. And then we did an exhibition next May, so not May 2022, but May 2023. Let's say we have a great chamber of commerce in Maine that could make this available to local businesses all across the state. These kids will get good at things that these businesses are really interested in. And I think that's just, I call it the low-hanging orchard. Kids getting good at a proficiency they enjoy in the context of being great contributing members of their school community or their local community. And by the time they're 18, have a proficiency that means 10 hours a week in summers, they could pay tuition, room, and board of any state college in Maine and come out ahead. I mean, that's a bold goal. It's like, what if you don't go after bold goals in life? Why are we here, right? So that's what I'm really excited about.
That is great. Well, we look forward to hearing more about that, Ted. And by the way, none of us Mainers missed the fact that you strategically baited the idea of coming back in the summertime. We all noticed that, Ted. But that's exciting, and thank you, Ted. Let's give Ted a round of applause for his outstanding exciting beginning to our session. And now we're going to transition to a panel of people who are on the ground and helping us as a state and beyond, helping us think about things differently, and kind of taking some of these ideas that Ted has put out, and many of them are actively using some of Ted's ideas and many other ideas to help us make that happen. So I'm very excited about that. Let me just introduce the panel members that we have with us. We have some terrific people, people that have been around Maine education for a while and have just give us a lot of hope and inspiration and great leadership. First person is the Honorable Boyd Marley. He is the principal of the East End Community School in Portland. He did his BA at USM in criminology and a master's in inclusive education at UNE, which made him a terrific legislator in the early 2000s. And I think that I could not have shared the Portland delegation with anybody more committed to education. I was on the education committee, and he was just a terrific advocate for education in the legislature, and just a truly wonderful guy doing some great things at East End School. We also have Elena Margison. She is the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. She's an assistant professor of education and director of the education program at University of Maine at Presque Isle, and she is also the cousin of Andrea Stairs Davenport, the USM education chair, and she explained why, and she may share that she explained that why she is, and how that happened in the family, that so many of her family members became educators. And we also have PENDER MAKIN. She is the Commissioner of Education, probably needs no introduction, but I also say that at USM, Husky Nation holds her as one of our best examples of our alumna. She is more than 20-year career. She has devoted herself to the mission of public education. From 97 to 2003, she served as a classroom teacher at the Westcott Junior High School in Westbrook, and then she went on to become the principal of the Real School, the Regional Educational Alternative Learning School on Mackworth Island, where she exemplified many of the things that Ted was just talking about. And finally, we have Jeremy Jones. He's new this year as the executive director of the Maine Charter School Commission. He is from Texas and moved here recently from Nashville. He currently lives in Old Orchard Beach and the surrounding areas. He is the executive director of the Maine Charter School Commission, and prior to this, he served at multiple levels on the authorizing and operation sides of charter school movement throughout Texas and beyond. So that is, those are the people that will be helping us. And I guess I'll have, I was going to start with a question to the panelists. It seems like there's a lot of agreement about where we could be. A lot of people certainly nodding their heads as Ted was talking and adding to the chat, and yet we have some work to do. And I guess my question to each of you, well, let's just go around and we'll start with Boyd. The question is, tell us what do you see as barriers, and what do you see as how do we get to that place? How do we start moving in that direction where our curriculum is authentic and our instruction is coaching and our curriculum itself is meaningful, and that people, our natural curiosity as Homo sapiens are truly engaged. So Boyd, I know you're up to the task, but I'm going to start with you, if you would. What are the barriers? Why aren't we there? And what optimism, if any, do you see?
Well, thank you. And I've enjoyed the conversation. And if we have Ted's enthusiasm, we will get there. You know, I think a lot of it is adult mindsets. There's a great piece around called The Opportunity Myth from the New Teacher Project, TNTP, and it talks about adult decisions and what we do impacting like student outcomes. And so, and like there's been a number of questions within the chat talking about like policy decisions that we make, decisions we make around curriculum. Because one of the questions I want to ask you guys is around credentialing and teacher programs, because I think we have to help students come out of schools that are educators be prepared to take that leap, if you will, to be able to have enough of a pedagogic foundation and that confidence to take some of the risks that Ted's talking about. So I think it's around adults being able to take the risk, but also policymakers given us some latitude in how they quantify the work that we're doing.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. And by the way, I think I just want to give credit to Emmanuel Pariser, who brilliantly cited even more directly what I'm asking. How do we get our communities to support an approach of education that is radically different from what they experienced when they were students? I think that's just much better said, and I wish I had talked to Emmanuel before I made that question. Alana, I'm going to move to you if I could. Can you talk to us a little bit about how do we get that change? How do we radically change the way we think and overcome some of the barriers that we talked about?
I think that there is that need for a shift. When we think about accountability, I think that there needs to be a shift away from accountability in terms of how that's measured by a test, or even assessments that we've previously thought of in our own minds. I think when we turn over some of that agency to students to be able to define and then perform what accomplishment, what success looks like we saw in the film, and like Ted has talked about previously this evening, that's really exciting. And I think part of that shift happens in the way that we prepare our pre-service teachers. And that's a huge focus, obviously, from my end. And I think that's looking at models like High Tech High, I think reflects much of what we know as good teaching and learning. It's focusing on these active learning models. And it reminds me a lot of expeditionary learning, project-based learning, authentic assessments where there's a real world problem that's being solved by students. I think a lot of how we're shifting, or how we might shift, is to rethink accountability and success and give more student voice, and then help our pre-service teachers create instructional plans and designs and assessments that honor student agency and student voice in that process. And I think we're getting there. I think that that's, especially given some of the challenges of COVID, as we come back to our new normal, and this has been referenced, I know, by my colleague at USM, and maybe Flynn Ross, I see, is in the chat too. I mean, Fiona shared a bit about the blogs that she has done, and just thinking about, let's think about what we're going to do better and how we're going to honor, coming back and really honoring doing school differently. And I think we're on the right track.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Alana. Commissioner MAKIN, what can we do to shift our thinking more radically and get parents and others to understand that transformation?
Well, I have to say I very much agree with Alana when she talks about this chasing a score on a standardized test as being the one measure that we really have. It's what we hold up in our state to say, well, our reading scores were here and our math scores were here. And we have, as I think it was Tony Wagner in Global Achievement Gap, his book, well over a decade ago. And he said, what is marginally important, but easy to measure, is gaining false importance. And look out, because that which is truly deeply important, but difficult to measure, is falling by the wayside in this data-driven culture where we're looking for something between a 0 and a 4 that we can see a straight line trajectory and feed it through some sort of so that has been very painful. And also there's another one, it's over a decade now still, but I can't believe it hasn't gotten more play. And that would be World-Class Learners by Yang Zhao. If you have not read that, I certainly encourage you to. He's even done some models to show that when standardized test scores go up in countries, and he was doing the international one from the early 1960s, and he modeled it up through the 90s. Whenever standardized scores were on the rise, trending upward, GDP was trending downward, because we were teaching these children to think like, a test, a bubble sheet. And it was the converse the other way. I mean, that's just incredibly, I think it's fascinating. And the culture of accountability, which was ushered in heavily with the No Child Left Behind movement, I think is, when you talk about barriers, the biggest barrier is trust in our education system. It's trust in the educators who have gone to school for this, who have the expertise. They know what learning is. They know that they can see a child spark or begin to blossom or struggle or challenge or engage. They can do that with their teacher eyes because they have practiced for so long, and yet they don't understand that their teacher eyes are a finely tuned assessment instrument. And instead, the child has to, in order for the teachers even to believe at this point that the child is proficient, we, the system, the culture of externally applied accountability as measured by something that was crafted not by the teacher. It used to be teachers created the lessons and they modified them and they created the assessments and they used those assessments to measure how somebody was doing, and they would change their tactic to better reach that child. That's when there was professionalism and deep respect for our educators. And as we applied external accountability to humans who are already pre-motivated to be accountable, they showed up their first day at work to do the very best they could do for students. And there's plenty of brain research to show that when you try to hold somebody artificially externally accountable for something that they showed up already pre-accountable for, you have just completely disenfranchised them. So we have pushed the professionalism away from our educators. We have reduced school leaders to middle management at best. We've handed them stuff to hand down to be implemented. And I am very eager in our state to remind people that learning doesn't happen in content silos. We have just come out of a long period of a march toward proficiency, general proficiency in every single content area. We have 8 content areas in our state, and we were getting that to the point we were measuring granularly how well a student was doing in a specific content area, and then they went down a hall and did a different content. That's not the way anybody thinks, learns, or behaves in our world. And so we're very much encouraging Maine educators and school leaders and district leaders and the school boards and the community support them. Please know that from our perspective, where we're sitting right now, we can explain the standardized test scores. If you're afraid to move out of that box because what if the assessment isn't measuring the way we're teaching right now, we can explain that. And we can embrace our guiding principles, interdisciplinary standards of, performance standards, showing that, we have so many exciting directions that we could go as a state. And our team at the Department of Education is ready to support you and to defend you and to hold you up as the professionals that you are, because this is where we need to move.
Wow, that is great. Great conversation from the Commissioner of Education. Thank you. Jeremy, tell us what you see as we start to move in this direction.
Sure. I'm just like learning as much as anybody here. So I appreciate the opportunity and love soaking in all this wisdom. I will say that, harken back to Sir Ken Robinson and something that both Boyd and PENDER just hit on here is, as educators, we are the system, right? I think a lot of times we sort of point to this amorphous thing out in the ether, and it's easy to blame somebody. But if there are classroom teachers on this call right now, I would say, like, you are the system. Like, revolutions happen in classrooms, and you just heard your Commissioner of Education give you permission to do things differently and to challenge the status quo. And I would also encourage that. Start doing that. I watched the film last night, Ted, and was so inspired and thinking to myself, like, High Tech High is a magical place, but we've got one of those here in Maine. Go to the Baxter School of Science and Technology and go down there on a Friday when they're doing Flex Fridays, and kids are literally building their own drones. They're using the Tesla coil. They're building guitars. They're doing all sorts of things. They're doing fashion manufacturing, just incredible things happening on that campus. You see it in Hinckley at the Maine Academy of Natural Sciences, where they're out, literally, their knees in the mud in the greenhouse, feeding the tilapia, who are then feeding the plants. They're then harvesting the plants and providing food for the community, or at the Ecology Learning Center, where kids are out tapping trees and spending multiple days a week out in the environment and being connected to the land. I mean, these things are happening. And I know that there's a sense of urgency of the people on this call tonight to expand those opportunities and make sure they're equitably distributed across our state and across our nation. But we've got to figure out how to remove some of these barriers, because they're happening in small pockets and we have to celebrate that. I think Ted's work does a good job of celebrating it. And I think, us on this call can do a good job of celebrating each other as well.